Walter Keene was the kind of man who never left a routine unfinished. A Navy man for over 2 decades, then a school shop teacher for 15 more, he had a quiet discipline about him. Never loud, never rushed, just steady. He was the kind of grandfather who made breakfast at 5 a.m. sharp, who folded his socks in pairs, who kept his fishing rods lined up in the shed like rifles in a rack. On the morning of July 9, 2014, Walter followed that same routine one more time. He got up at 3:50, made coffee, packed the small cooler with turkey sandwiches, just like always. At 4:15 a.m., his daughter Julie walked him to the door, handed him the thermos, and told him to text if the weather changed. He promised he would. And then he was gone. Lake Merrill wasn't far, about 19 minutes from their house just outside Corbett, Oregon. A narrow, forest-framed lake, mostly known to locals, with one gravel access road and a small launch site built in the 60s. Walter had been fishing there since his 20s. He knew every cove, every current. He had a custom hand-drawn depth chart pinned to his garage wall with penciled notes from years of fishing. Shallow shelf, avoid anchor, trout near lilies, strong drop-off after third pine. If there was ever a place he could disappear in, no one expected it to be this one. By noon, Julie hadn't heard from him. She wasn't alarmed at first. Reception around the lake was spotty, and Walter didn't always remember to check his phone. But by 4, when the sun was beginning to dip and her boys were asking if Grandpa was back yet, something felt off. She drove to the lake herself, expecting to see his truck already hitched and headed home. Instead, it was still there. Parked exactly where it always was, driver's door unlocked, keys resting on the dash, and the same dented thermos cup sitting in the cup holder. There were no signs of damage, no broken glass, no blood, no scuff marks. His boat trailer was empty. The boat was nowhere in sight. She called the sheriff's office just after 7 p.m. and told them her father was missing. The dispatcher entered it as a welfare check, but within an hour, 2 deputies arrived on site. They walked the shoreline with flashlights. They called Walter's phone, which rang once and then went to voicemail. By midnight, the truck had been towed. The boat was listed as missing, and a case file had been opened with Walter Keene listed as last seen entering Lake Merrill, presumed missing on water. At that point, the assumption was simple. Maybe he fell in, maybe he had a medical event, maybe the boat drifted and capsized. It happens. But then the questions started piling up. The weather had been perfect that day. Clear skies, no wind, calm surface. The lake wasn't known for strong currents, and in early July, the water was warm enough to survive in for hours, not minutes. Walter was a strong swimmer. He always wore his life jacket, and even if something went wrong, there should have been debris, an oar, a hat, a tackle box. Nothing had surfaced. Not a single item floated ashore. Not a sound had been heard. No one on the lake that morning reported seeing his boat, not even the ranger. By day 2, search and rescue teams were on site with sonar, divers, and a low-flying chopper. They covered every accessible inch of the lake. They dragged shallow sections, used grid sweeps and dog teams along the perimeter. Divers searched the deeper channel known as Devil's Hook, a jagged underwater drop near the north end, where more than one boat had snagged or tipped over in the past. Still nothing. No boat, no body. Not even a single fishing lure turned up. Julie told reporters she wasn't angry yet, just confused. Her father wasn't the type to get lost or make careless mistakes. He checked oil levels before every trip. He replaced the motor himself last year and had installed a brand new GPS fish finder just 2 weeks prior. It was supposed to make things easier for him, give him deeper scan readings, but now it was gone too. She wondered aloud, what if something else had happened? What if he hadn't gone missing by accident? Investigators retraced everything they could. They pulled traffic camera footage, but Lake Merrill's gravel road didn't have surveillance. Walter's last ATM withdrawal was 3 days prior at a gas station 10 miles away. No unusual purchases, no flagged behavior. His phone record showed no calls after 6:12 a.m. when it pinged a tower just east of the lake. Then nothing. Julie asked if maybe the phone had died. A deputy told her even a dead phone could sometimes ping if restarted. Walter's never did. The community held a small vigil by the launch dock that Sunday. They lit candles, floated flowers on the lake, and waited. It wasn't the first time someone had disappeared near water, but this felt different. People talked in low voices about how a man like Walter wouldn't just vanish. One woman said she saw an unfamiliar boat out there that morning, black hull, no registration numbers. She said it circled once, then disappeared behind the trees. The tip was written down, logged, and eventually buried in the noise of an unsolved case. No evidence supported it. No one followed up. No one knew where to start. Weeks passed, then months. The official search was suspended by late August. The lake gave nothing back, not even a ripple. Julie kept a file box in her closet with maps, dog reports, newspaper clippings. She highlighted every area divers had searched. She called the sheriff's office once a month to ask if anything had turned up. She began visiting the lake alone, standing by the same launch her father used to love. Every time, she brought his favorite bait and threw one hook into the water, just in case. 9 years later, long after the case had gone cold and most had forgotten his name, the water finally moved again. Not with waves or wind, but with something caught in the brush after a storm, something that should have sunk or drifted away, something that should have been gone, but wasn't. Here's the morning after Walter Keene was reported missing. Lake Merrill looked deceptively calm. Sunlight broke clean across the water. From the shoreline, there was no sign of struggle, no ripple that hadn't come from wind or wildlife. By 8 a.m., the first dive team arrived in a black truck from the county search and rescue unit. They began with a basic sweep, 10-meter grids from the main dock outward, searching for an overturned vessel, debris, clothing, or anything unnatural beneath the surface. The water was murky that week, summer algae thickening from recent heat, but visibility wasn't the problem. The problem was that there was nothing to find. 2 more teams followed. By noon, 6 divers were working shifts, paired with sonar and pole scans. They swept the northern coves first, where currents sometimes funneled wayward debris. Then they moved to the deeper southern shelf, past Devil's Hook. The wind had picked up slightly, and gusts muddied the surface near the reeds. A helicopter circled the lake for aerial angles, hoping to catch a glint of aluminum in the trees or a stranded shape bobbing near shore. The silver hull of Walter's boat should have reflected something. It didn't. The first piece of evidence arrived that afternoon, a life jacket floating near the northern bank tangled in reeds. For a moment the team braced for confirmation, but it was brand new. No wear, no label, not even waterlogged. Definitely not Walter's. Searchers marked the find and continued, but the disappointment lingered. It felt like the lake was pretending he'd never been there. Walter's flip phone was the next lead. Around 4:30 p.m., a sheriff's deputy contacted the cell provider to pull tower pings. One location returned, 6:42 a.m., Southeast Inlet. That was nearly 2 hours after Walter had launched and 20 minutes before his daughter had texted him. The Southeast Inlet wasn't unusual. It was a good trout spot. But when teams got there by 5 p.m., the weather had shifted. A sudden thunderstorm, brief but heavy, hit the area hard. Rain came in sideways, sending mud and branches into the water. Within 20 minutes, the shore was unrecognizable. If anything had been there, it was gone now. By day's end, the command tent logged the status as active, no recovery. No blood, no physical evidence, no witness sightings. His truck remained untouched in the lot. His boat had vanished. And his phone, if still powered on, had gone silent. There were no credit card swipes, no additional pings, and no 911 calls placed from his number. It was as if the lake had swallowed not just a man, but all signs that he ever arrived. By day 3, whispers began. At the gas station, someone asked Julie if Walter had been sick. A woman in line said maybe he had a heart attack. Or maybe, just maybe, he'd decided he'd had enough and left on his own terms. The theory picked up in town faster than she expected. A local reporter even asked if Walter had any known history of depression. Julie said no, and she meant it. He was steady. He walked 2 miles a day, didn't drink, took his medication, played cards with the boys every Friday. He was grounded, focused, and always came home by dusk. Whatever this was, it wasn't intentional. Deputies checked into the voluntary disappearance theory. They ran Walter's name through transit and border logs. Nothing. No tickets purchased, no license plate hits. His bank accounts remained untouched. His VA pension came through on the 10th and sat there. A voluntary disappearance usually left financial fingerprints. Walter left none. Still, the label remained quietly present in the background of the case file. Possibility. Self-initiated absence, unconfirmed. Back at the lake, the search widened. The area around the southeast inlet was examined by cadaver dogs flown in from Salem. They hit on one location, a shallow rock shelf covered in storm-washed brush. Divers returned, but the alert turned out to be animal remains, possibly deer, degraded too far to determine. It wasn't human. It wasn't Walter. By the end of week 1, the case moved into cold response. No fresh leads, no new evidence. The search effort shrank from daily to scheduled. Julie kept asking about the GPS fish finder Walter had installed just weeks before. Could it have stored his boat's path? Could it be traced? The answer was unclear. If the unit had a memory card, it might hold something. But the device was never recovered, and no one was even sure what model it was. He'd bought it used at a garage sale. The receipt wasn't found. Julie started posting flyers, not just in Corbett, but in surrounding counties, bait shops, campgrounds. She asked people to report any sightings of a 12-foot silver aluminum boat with a blue bench cushion. She handed out photos of Walter and his fishing gear. She offered a $2,000 reward. Some calls came in. None panned out. A man reported seeing a similar boat near Sweet Creek Falls. Another said he found a rod with initials WK on the grip, but it was too worn to prove. No serial number, no link. All dead ends. The weight of uncertainty began to shift how people remembered him. Walter went from the dependable vet with perfect attendance to the guy who maybe just slipped away. It's not that anyone meant harm by it. It's just what happens when a story loses traction. People fill in the blanks. They make peace with disappearance. But Julie never did. To her, the case wasn't cold, it was suspended. Waiting. Paused somewhere just beyond what the lake was willing to show. She told her sons over and over, he didn't leave, he didn't drown. He didn't just give up. 9 years later, when the lake finally gave back what it had hidden, investigators would realize she was right. Walter hadn't disappeared on purpose. He had tried, in his final moments, to leave behind something someone might one day find. Something that proved he hadn't been alone on that water. Something that explained the silence. 7 days after Walter Keene vanished, the lake began to turn on itself. The search teams had covered every logical area, every shallow stretch, and still there was nothing. That's when they looked toward Devil's Hook, a place they'd all quietly avoided until then. It wasn't superstition, it was logistics. Devil's Hook was a steep inlet on the northwest side of Lake Merrill, flanked by sharp rocks, a sudden drop-off, and decades' worth of submerged timber. Boats rarely passed through it. Locals said it chewed up motors. It was where dead branches sank and never came back up, where the lake was deepest, quietest. On July 16th, cadaver dogs were brought to that side of the shoreline. 2 black labs, trained in water recovery, barked twice near a sunken root cluster about 10 yards out. The handler said the signal wasn't strong, but it was enough to investigate. Divers were sent in later that afternoon. It was slow work. Visibility was under 3 feet, and the submerged logjam made maneuvering dangerous. The crevice beneath Devil's Hook was deeper than expected, close to 25 feet in places, and jagged. Some of the wood was newer, washed in from spring storms, but most of it had been rotting there for decades. The first dive produced nothing. The second, conducted at an angle between 2 splintered pine logs, uncovered something unexpected. An olive-green plastic box snagged on a branch 15 feet down. Divers brought it up in a mesh basket. It was waterlogged but intact. A tackle box. Inside, carefully packed between rusted lures and rubber bait, was a small folding knife with WK scratched into the base. It was Walter's. Julie identified it immediately. Her father always kept that knife clipped to the interior lid, said it reminded him of field kits from the Navy. The tackle box was a match, but it didn't explain anything. There was no sign of damage, no blood, no indication of distress. Everything inside was orderly. The latches still worked. the hook still aligned in their trays. If Walter had capsized, it didn't show in this box. It looked like it had been placed there, deliberately. Investigators logged the box as personal property and labeled the find as circumstantial. It was returned to Julie with a short report, recovered 15 FT below surface, no biological evidence, no anomalies. But she didn't buy it. Her father never lost things. He didn't just drop a tackle box in a lake he knew better than his own street. And if something had happened near Devil's Hook, why was that the only item that surfaced? That's when she hired a private investigator. His name was Ben Sorensen. Former cop, early 60s, worked missing persons for over 20 years before going freelance. Julie gave him everything: maps, receipts, phone logs, even Walter's handwritten notes from his last few fishing trips. Sorensen started by retracing the timeline. The last known ping from Walter's phone was near the southeast inlet. The tackle box was found in the northwest crevice. That's nearly 1.5 miles of water between. If Walter had floated, the boat would have shown up. If he swam, he would have needed help. If he capsized, debris would have been scattered across that entire range. But the lake was clean, which meant something had been removed. Sorensen zeroed in on one detail others had skipped over: the GPS fish finder. It wasn't part of the tackle box, it wasn't recovered from the lake, and it wasn't in the truck. According to Julie, Walter had picked it up from a local garage sale a few weeks prior. He installed it himself. Brand unknown, model unknown, but Julie remembered it had a small SD card slot. She had asked what it did. Walter said, "It tracks my drops," meaning his fishing paths, coordinates, depth logs. If it had still been powered, and if the card was still inside, it could have stored his entire trip across the lake that morning. Sorensen filed a public record request with nearby pawn shops and resale stores, trying to trace used electronics sold that summer. He got nowhere. No one remembered the exact unit. No serial numbers existed. But that didn't stop him. He checked online forums for DIY fish finder repairs, hoping someone local had bought or flipped a similar model. One user from a Corbett fishing page posted a blurry image of what might have been the same brand, but the post was 5 years old, and the user hadn't been active since. Still, Sorensen noted one thing. If someone had found the boat, stripped the tech and dumped the rest, they'd likely keep the GPS, not for resale, but for protection. If it had a memory card, it could contain more than just coordinates. It might hold timestamps, patterns, routes. And if someone wanted to hide something that happened on that lake, that data card was now the most important piece missing. Julie asked why no one thought to look for it sooner. Sorensen said it was because most people assume lakes bury the truth. They don't think someone would come back to erase it, but someone had. The theory was growing, though quietly. Not among police. Officially, they still leaned toward accidental drowning. But in the silence between updates, Walter hadn't just vanished. Something had moved with purpose. The empty boat, the intact tackle box, the missing GPS unit. Every piece was neat, quiet, deliberate, like someone had gone back to rearrange the story after it happened. 9 years later, when Walter's boat finally returned, wedged in the mud and caught in the roots, it wouldn't be the water that gave up the truth. It would be what was missing from it, what wasn't supposed to be touched, the GPS that had been deliberately taken, the map that was never meant to be seen. By spring of the following year, the Keene case had settled into silence. No new evidence had surfaced, no boats had washed ashore, and no bones had been found in the mud. In the official files, Walter Keene was listed as presumed drowned, unrecovered. But in town, that wasn't the version people remembered. Not really. People don't forget when someone vanishes without a trace. They just change the way they talk about it. At the bait shop near Lake Morrell, an old man who came in every Friday swore he saw an unfamiliar SUV parked by the boat ramp that morning. Black, out-of-state plates, no decals. Said it was gone by 8. He didn't think much of it at the time. It was only after the flyers went up that it stuck with him. When he mentioned it to deputies 2 weeks later, they wrote it down, logged the tip, and never followed up. Around the same time, a woman named Carla Townsend came forward with a story from her daughter. They had been camping at the East Ridge that same morning, up early to make breakfast before hiking. Her daughter, 7 at the time, told her she heard a man yelling on the water sometime around 6:45 a.m. When Carla looked, she said she saw nothing. The girl was adamant, said the man was angry, but when Carla mentioned it to the rangers later that week, they shrugged it off. Said sound travels strangely over water. Could have been anything. Then there was the hermit fisherman, name withheld in the report, but known around town as Rick Three Hooks. He lived out of a cabin near the lake, came into town once a month for canned food and liquor, and fished alone every day unless it rained. Rick told a deputy, months after the fact, that on the morning Walter disappeared, he heard a motor revving and stalling near Devil's Hook around sunrise. Said it sounded like someone was trying to move but couldn't. He never saw the boat, but he remembered the noise. Claimed it kept sputtering, like it was turning in place. Then stopped. When asked why he didn't report it sooner, Rick just said no one asked. All of this ended up in a folder labeled Unconfirmed Anecdotal Reports, a section of the case file that collected dust under an old desk at the sheriff's office. Leads without evidence, stories without witnesses, the kind of details that don't hold up in court or press conferences. But for Walter's son, Adam, they meant something. He wasn't a cop or a diver or a tracker. He was a mechanic, quiet, methodical. He didn't make speeches at vigils. He didn't post online. But a few weeks after the case was labeled inactive, he bought a new notebook. Wrote "Dad Notes" on the cover and began to log everything. He visited Lake Merrill on the first Thursday of every month, parked in the same spot where the truck had been left, walked the edges, checked water levels near Devil's Hook, left a single red flower each time, wedged between the wooden planks of the dock. He made notes on the weather, on any debris he found. Once, in early July, he fished out a boot. Turned out not to be Walter's, but he recorded it anyway. Documented its size, condition, exact location. He wasn't chasing theories. He was building a pattern, in case one ever emerged. Word spread in town. People who'd stayed quiet in the early months started saying more. A teenager said he remembered seeing a man with binoculars near the ridge trail that day, watching the lake but not fishing. Another local recalled a single set of wet boot prints near the ranger shed hours after Walter's truck had already been taped off. None of it added up, none of it connected. But Adam wrote it all down, line by line, date by date. By 2016, the stories faded. The lake got quiet again. The Keene flyers were gone from the store windows. The vigil candles had long melted. The Keene family, still living in the same house, stopped getting calls from the sheriff's office. There were no updates to give, nothing new to try. The search was closed. Officially, Walter had joined the long list of lost, one of those cases that remained painful for a few, but forgettable for most. But Adam never stopped logging. Even when the leads dried up, he wrote. Even when nothing happened for weeks, he made notes. Water temperature, new erosion, any changes in the tree line. He didn't expect a miracle. He didn't believe in closure, but he did believe in evidence, and he believed the lake hadn't been honest yet. Julie, too, held on in quieter ways. She kept Walter's boots by the door. She never shut off his phone account in case one day it turned on again. She cooked for 5 on holidays, not 4. They didn't talk about it as much by then, but they didn't pretend it was over either. Something had happened. Someone had been out there with him, and they believed one day the water would say so. 9 years later, it did. Not in the way anyone expected, not with a body or a confession, but with the return of something physical, something real, a boat no one thought would ever resurface. And tucked inside that boat, beneath damp canvas and warped boards, was a message. One that would make the town look back at every rumor and wonder why they ever stopped listening. 4 years after Walter Keene vanished, the lake was quiet again. No more dive teams, no more press trucks, just families in rented rowboats, weekend anglers with beers in their tackle bags, and silence. It was mid-September 2018 when Colleen Bell, a 39-year-old fitness blogger from Eugene, decided to hike the ridge west of Lake Merrill, looking for wildflowers and elevation. The trail wasn't official. Most people stuck to the east paths or circled the south bank. But Colleen had taken a wrong turn somewhere along the ridge and ended up in a patch of dry overgrowth where the trees thinned out and the ground was uneven from past slides. It was there, less than a mile uphill from Devil's Hook, that she saw something glint in the brush, just a flicker of metal tucked beneath a half-collapsed pile of branches. At first she thought it was trash, maybe old camp gear. But when she reached down, she found a rusted utility knife with a broken clip and the faded imprint of what looked like a military stock number etched along the handle. Nearby, tangled in dried bramble, was a shred of red and navy flannel, torn at the seams, soaked stiff with old dirt and time. She didn't think much of it at first, took a photo, tossed the knife and the cloth into her pack, assuming maybe she'd hand it to a ranger station later. But back in town that evening, she Googled the lake and saw Walter's name in an old article. The image of the flannel in the missing person flyer matched what she'd found. She made a call the next morning to the sheriff's department. For the first time in nearly 2 years, someone reopened the Keene file. Forensics confirmed it quickly. The knife was a military-issued folding blade, the same model Walter had logged with the VA decades prior. The serial number had partially worn off, but what remained matched the format used for the 1980s Navy Standard Kit, identical to the one Walter was issued. The flannel scrap, though impossible to extract DNA from after so long, was consistent in fabric, color, and stitching to the shirt Walter had been wearing the morning he disappeared. A copy of the original photo showed him standing on the dock in the same pattern, a red plaid with navy lines and a slightly mismatched left sleeve. The tear found on the cloth was on that same sleeve. The discovery pulled the investigation back into motion. Detectives revisited the Western Ridge for the first time since the original search. The area was steep, unstable, and largely ignored in 2014 because it was considered unreachable by boat and irrelevant to known fishing zones. But now, with a confirmed physical link to Walter's belongings, they hiked in with new intent. The ground had shifted since 2014. Soil erosion from wet winters, tree falls, and animal activity had changed the landscape. Still, they canvassed the area. No additional gear, no skeletal remains, no watch, no wallet, no boots, just the knife and the cloth. A single clue, sitting just far enough outside the expected zone to shift everything. Julie and Adam were notified the same day. Adam added the site to his logbook with a red tab. He visited the location himself the following week. Hiked alone. Quiet. Took a sample of the soil in a mason jar and placed a small metal tag on the branch where the knife had been found. He didn't say much about it afterward, just wrote in the margin, "This wasn't random." Investigators pulled weather data from the summer of 2014. Satellite imaging showed that between July 10th and 11th, less than 48 hours after Walter vanished, the Western Ridge experienced a sudden, intense flash flood caused by upstream rainfall. The slope beneath Devil's Hook had buckled temporarily, with runoff pushing debris further up the ridge than normal. It was brief, but enough to alter water flow, drag branches, and possibly relocate any unsecured items. The possibility emerged. Had Walter, disoriented or injured, drifted toward the wrong side of the lake and tried to climb out through the Western Ridge? And if he had the rain washed away any trace of what happened next? It wasn't far-fetched. The lake was unpredictable in pockets. Fog in the early morning could obscure visibility. If Walter's boat had lost motor power or taken on water, he might have drifted without control. If he'd attempted to beach the boat and climb out, possibly injured, trying to find help, it would explain the knife being drawn, the flannel torn, the lack of return. But again, the lake gave no follow-through, no answers, only partial clues, always weather-worn, always late. The theory stayed unofficial, buried under cautious phrasing. Alternative scenario, subject potentially exited vessel voluntarily. But to Julie, it was another quiet confirmation. Her father hadn't died instantly. He had moved. He had fought to survive. She said the fact that the knife was unsheathed meant he planned to use it, whether to cut branches, defend himself, or signal. It wasn't left behind. It was carried until it wasn't. The sheriff's department closed the revisit with no new leads, no active suspects. The ridge was noted as previously unsearched but non-conclusive. In the years to come, hikers passed the area often. Some saw the tag Adam left. Most didn't notice. The moment had passed, but the implications stayed. By then, even the lake seemed content to withhold the rest. Walter's face had faded from flyers. His name still hung in the backroom wall at the station, pinned to a corkboard labeled "Long-Term Missing." But the space around his case had grown colder. Fewer calls, less interest. Just a flannel scrap and a rusted knife that said he had, at some point, stood where no one thought he could have reached. It wasn't until the trees came down, until the lake flooded and receded again, that someone found what he had left behind. Something no one expected to survive that long. Something waiting inside the boat that had once held everything he'd brought with him. And more. 9 years after Walter Keene disappeared into the still waters of Lake Merrill, his story had become little more than a local footnote. The occasional true crime podcast mentioned it in passing. A few missing persons forms updated the case file once a year with no changes. Even the laminated photo at the ranger station had curled inward from sun damage. The lake had gone silent again. And then the storm came. June the 2nd, 2023. A severe weather system passed over the Oregon backcountry, bringing 70-mile-per-hour winds, sheet rain, and microbursts strong enough to tear through the northern tree line like paper. In less than 6 hours, 7 trees were uprooted near the northwest floodplain of Lake Merrill. The banks overflowed. Parts of the footpath collapsed. It wasn't until 3 days later, once the water began to recede, that anyone saw what the storm had shaken loose. 2 hikers, both from Portland, were passing through the trail system near the northern floodplain. The path was still muddy, slick with runoff. They cut through a thicket to avoid a fallen tree and noticed something metallic jammed between 2 collapsed trunks, halfway submerged in standing water. It looked like a crushed canoe at first, folded slightly, discolored with age. But as they pushed closer, it became clear. This wasn't just any boat. It was Walter's. The aluminum hull was dull, its once shiny surface stained with 9 years of moss and silt. The registration sticker had long peeled off, but the shallow dent near the bow matched the photo in the original police file. Inside, the bench seats were waterlogged, partially rotted, and filled with debris. But a green jacket was still draped over the middle seat, sleeves tucked in like someone had set it down gently and never returned. Deputies were called. The scene was secured by sundown. The first thing recovered was Walter's thermos, wedged near the rear compartment. The lid had rusted shut, sealed tight by time. The tackle box was there too, not the one found years earlier, but a smaller one, pressed under the seat storage compartment, still latched, still sealed. When opened, it revealed spare lures, a spool of wire, and beneath them something no one expected. A wrapped notebook, plastic wrapped in a torn freezer bag. The paper was warped, the edges browned and soft, but the cover was intact. Written in faded ink, in Walter's unmistakable blocky handwriting, were 3 words. They followed me. For the first time in nearly a decade, the case was reopened. The boat's recovery site was nearly a half-mile inland from any reasonable drift path. Investigators marked the position on updated satellite maps and concluded the boat had not floated there on its own. It had been manually pulled, lodged into a dense section of forest unlikely to be reached without intent. The trees that once hid it had masked it for years, branches covering the hull, brush growing up along the sides. Only the storm had exposed it, which raised the question, who hid it? Forensic teams began photographing the interior. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no drag marks. The jacket was folded, not thrown. The bait jars hadn't cracked open. It looked like someone had stopped mid-trip and packed things with care. But the most damning absence was what wasn't there at all, the GPS fish finder. The mount was still bolted to the side rail, but the unit itself was missing, removed cleanly. The wiring had been clipped short. Someone had taken it. The notebook was turned over to forensics for preservation. Inside were 5 entries, each handwritten, each dated July 9, 2014. The first read like a journal. Out early, fog's thin. Fish aren't biting yet. The second shifted in tone. Saw 2 men pass me slow, no rods, black boat, no plates. The third was sharper. They circled back, stayed 50 yards out. I don't think they're fishing. The fourth. Motor failed. I think they're waiting for me to drift. Don't trust the ranger. And the fifth, the last one, just repeated the phrase on the cover, they followed me. The handwriting matched samples from Walter's journals at home. The ink was tested, the same brand of pen Walter kept in his glove box. The water damage was consistent with long-term exposure, but the bag had kept most of the writing legible. It was authentic, and it changed everything. By the end of the week, local news ran the headline, "Missing Man's Boat, Found After 9 Years, Disturbing Notebook Sparks New Investigation." The case, once cold, was now classified as a suspicious disappearance under possible duress. Julie and Adam were contacted by detectives. They were shown the notebook. Adam didn't say much. Julie cried quietly and asked only one question. Why had no one thought to look there before? No one had a good answer. The boat was extracted and taken into evidence. The hull showed no force damage, but scrape marks on the underside suggested it had been dragged over dry terrain, not pushed by water. Investigators theorized that the storm had dislodged the trunks hiding it, exposing what had been stashed years before. Whether by Walter himself or someone else remained unclear. But someone had left the boat exactly where no one would find it, until the weather decided otherwise. The discovery reignited local memory. People who had stayed silent for years began talking again. Some remembered a black boat with no decals. Others recalled a ranger who no longer worked there. The whispers returned, but now with something to anchor them. Walter hadn't simply vanished. He'd left a record, a physical handwritten message. And someone, somewhere, had made sure it was buried just deep enough. That night, Adam returned to the lake, stood alone on the dock where his father had last been seen. He opened his notebook and added a single new line under the year 2023. The boat came back. The notebook was no longer just evidence. It had become a message, one that rewrote everything investigators thought they knew about Walter Keene's disappearance. After 9 years of silence, the 5 short entries inside that water-warped paper had spoken more loudly than 1,000 search grids. And each line pushed the case in a direction no one had considered seriously until now. Walter hadn't just vanished. He had been watched, followed, possibly hunted. The first entry, time-stamped in the top right corner, simply read, "Out early, calm, fog thinning, first cast at 5:23. It was ordinary, routine, the kind of notes Walter had scribbled in his fishing journals for years, a man tracking his day, not his danger. The second entry, at 6:30 a.m., was different. The writing was still steady, but smaller. 2 men in black boat, no lights. Keep circling me. The third entry was sharper. They called out my name. The fourth shook something loose in every investigator who read it. Engine cut. I think they're waiting behind the trees. And the final entry, the one that would send the investigation spiraling towards someone unexpected, read, "Don't trust the ranger." Forensic specialists confirmed the ink's chemical composition matched a standard ballpoint pen Walter had been known to use. The water damage on the notebook was consistent with being stored in a damp environment for several years, but the plastic bag it had been wrapped in had preserved it well enough to confirm one thing. The handwriting was Walter's. His unique habit of underlining timestamps, his block lettering, his habit of ending statements without punctuation. This wasn't a planted note, it was a man writing in real time, documenting what was happening around him as it unfolded. Investigators reopened the full 2014 Park Service schedule, including ranger logs, shift rotations, and field reports. It was all automated now, digital records stored across several state-level databases. But back in 2014, those logs were partly handwritten, partly verbal. Not every hour was accounted for. Some rangers went entire shifts without checking in if nothing major occurred. That meant gaps, blind spots, and that's where they found something strange. On July 9, 2014, Ranger William Rhodes had been scheduled for a 6 a.m. patrol of the eastern banks of Lake Merrill. His sign-in was logged at 5:53 a.m., but there was no further activity recorded until 9:47 a.m., when he checked back in from the northern dock. That left a nearly 4-hour unverified window. No radio check-ins, no written logs, no digital trail. The original case investigators had never flagged it. It was assumed he'd been patrolling foot trails or clearing debris. But in the context of Walter's notebook, That silence now felt like something more. Detectives tracked down Rhodes, now retired and living 3 counties away. He agreed to speak, casually, not under suspicion, not yet. He said he remembered that day, recalled the old guy going missing, claimed he hadn't seen anything unusual. When asked if he'd been on the water that morning, he paused, said, no, he'd stuck to trail patrol, couldn't recall exactly where. When pressed on his time gap, he shrugged, probably lost track. But the department dug deeper. Personnel files showed that Rhodes had received 2 internal complaints during his service, both for aggressive behavior with visitors, both dismissed without formal action. In 2015, he had quietly taken early retirement after a dispute with a camper turned physical. No charges filed, but a pattern emerged: short temper, isolated work habits, and access to every corner of Lake Merrill without oversight. The phrase, "don't trust the ranger," hit differently now. Walter's family had never known who was on shift that day. They'd been told routine coverage, but Walter would have known. He had fished that lake for years. He likely knew Rhodes by name, possibly by history. If Walter had been followed, if something had spooked him enough to record it, to take the time to physically write it down while being circled on open water, then whatever had happened out there had unfolded slowly. Not in a panic, not in a crash, but in a series of decisions. Observations, warnings. Detectives reviewed the boat registration logs from that week in 2014. No record of a black boat with no decals, no evidence of unauthorized crafts. But eyewitness tips from the early search, once discarded as hearsay, had mentioned a black boat near Devil's Hook that morning. A man yelling, a motor sputtering in place, all of it now circled back with sharper clarity. They reviewed surveillance footage from a dockside bait shop 4 miles from the lake entrance. A single frame, time-stamped 5:18 a.m., captured a black unmarked bass boat on a trailer being pulled northbound. The license plate was unreadable. No follow-up had been made at the time. It was archived, forgotten. But now, it was enough to reframe everything. Julie asked detectives the same question she'd been asking for years. Why hadn't anyone connected these pieces before? The deputy in charge didn't have a good answer, just said, because nobody thought to believe him. Not back then. Not until now. The notebook, Walter's notebook, was entered into evidence under its own file number, WK23. It was photographed, scanned, and preserved in a climate-controlled envelope. But before it was stored, Adam asked to hold it. Just once. He wore gloves, turned each page carefully. His eyes didn't move past the last line. He read it out loud to himself, just once. Then he handed it back without a word. Something had happened out there. Something involving people Walter didn't recognize, people who knew his name, who followed him, who forced his engine to stop. And maybe someone who should have protected him, but didn't. And if that was true, it meant the boat hadn't just returned by chance. It meant someone had hidden it. And now, someone would need to answer for why. They weren't looking for it anymore, not actively. The case had already been reopened because of the boat, because of the notebook, because of the words, "don't trust the ranger." But it was a data analyst at the State Department who noticed the gap while reviewing Walter Keene's cell tower logs from 2014, a file previously considered routine. They were revisiting known facts to look for digital trails, timestamps, ties to physical geography. What they found was buried in a raw connection dump, just one line, an attempted call made at 6:44 a.m. on July 9th. It lasted exactly 3 seconds, then dropped. Not because of signal loss, but because the number it tried to reach never rang through. It wasn't 911. It wasn't Julie. It wasn't any family contact. The number traced back to a now deactivated direct dispatch line used by the Lake Merrill Park Rangers in 2014, not public, not published, assigned to the lead ranger's work cell at the time, William Rhodes. The discovery was immediate cause for escalation. The number had never shown up in previous case reviews because it hadn't been processed through standard emergency channels. It didn't trigger a 911 alert, didn't bounce through recorded dispatch lines. But it was logged by the tower. Walter had tried to call him, not just anyone, him. It raised more questions than it answered. Why would Walter call the ranger directly? Did he have the number saved? Was it given to him on a previous trip? Or was he panicking, scrolling through his recent contacts and hitting the first available lifeline? More disturbing, if Walter knew enough to call the ranger directly, was it because he trusted him or because he had no one else? Investigators reached out to William Rhodes again. By then, the pressure was growing. News coverage had ramped up. Articles were circulating with headlines linking Rhodes to the missing man's last words. He agreed to a second interview, this time at a neutral location with legal counsel present. His demeanor was calm, but different now, guarded, less cooperative. When asked about the phone number, he claimed not to recognize it, said he never gave his direct line to guests. When shown the tower record, he offered no explanation. Just said, "I don't know why he would have called me." They asked again where he was between 6:00 and 9 a.m. that day. He repeated the same vague answer. On foot patrol near the southern trailhead. Alone. No witnesses, no logs, no radio traffic. It had never been flagged because it had never been questioned. Until now. Then came the black boat. Back in 2014, it had been mentioned only in passing. A few scattered witness statements, one child's drawing handed to police and then folded into the background noise of an unsolved case. A black boat with no numbers. Quiet, circling, investigators never found it, never proved it existed. Now, they didn't have to, because it turned out someone had recorded it. It was footage taken by a camper named Daniel Ramos. He had been visiting Lake Merrill that week with his family, shooting B-roll on an old camcorder to make a hiking vlog. He never gave it to police. He wasn't questioned. He hadn't known anything was wrong. The tape was dated July 9th, shot just after sunrise. The original file had sat on a backup hard drive for nearly a decade. When investigators tracked Ramos down and asked if he had seen anything unusual that morning, he said no. But when they asked if he'd filmed anything, he remembered the camera. Dug it out of a drawer, gave them the SD card. What they saw changed everything. The footage was short, just under 48 seconds, shot from the bluff on the south side of Devil's Hook. The sun was still rising, light low. The camera pans across the lake, capturing the tree line, the water, and a single vessel slowly circling in the distance. The hull was black, no visible decals, no one was fishing, just movement, wide, slow loops, like watching or waiting. The boat matched the exact make and model registered to William Rhodes during his years as park ranger, a flat-nosed bass boat, black trim, side-mount motor. The registration logs had no record of it being in use that morning. No sign-outs, no scheduled patrols on water, but there it was, undeniable. Investigators confronted Rhodes with the footage. He leaned forward, squinted, claimed it wasn't his, said it could have been anyone's. But when they zoomed in on a distinctive crack near the rear seat, a repair job logged in a maintenance file from 2012, the denial fell apart. It was his boat. And it had been on the water that morning, right where Walter had written, "They're circling me." The failed call, the notebook, the missing GPS, the hidden boat. The picture was becoming clearer. And yet, Rhodes refused to change his story. Said he remembered nothing. Said Walter's name didn't ring a bell. Said if anything had happened, he wasn't part of it. But the timeline was unraveling fast. Walter's final phone ping had placed him near the southeast inlet at 6:42. His call to Rhodes was at 6:44. The camper's video, time-stamped 6:51, showed Rhodes' boat near Devil's Hook. The distances aligned. The opportunity was real. Julie asked the lead detective if this meant they could charge him. The answer wasn't satisfying. "Not yet," he said, "but we're getting closer." Still no body, still no definitive cause. But the weight of circumstantial evidence was stacking. And now, the next step was to ask a harder question. If Rhodes wasn't answering, maybe the land around him would. Because buried under years of silence was something Walter might have left behind, something that would soon turn up under the boat itself, and finally make the case impossible to ignore. 2 weeks after Walter Keene's boat was discovered deep in the fallen tree line, divers were sent back to scan the surrounding lake bed. The storm that had unearthed the vessel had also shifted layers of mud and root systems, exposing parts of the shore no one had seen in years. It didn't take long to find something else. Buried just feet from where the boat had rested was a rectangular object, wrapped in canvas and sealed with twine. Inside was a GPS transponder. The unit was degraded, but intact. A cracked screen, rusted metal, but the micro SD card inside had survived. When technicians pulled the data, they found something chilling. Walter's boat movements had been logged in detail. At 5:24 a.m. on the morning he vanished, the boat drifted normally through familiar fishing paths. Then, at 6:31, the path changed. Sudden zigzags, stops. The boat lingered near a ranger-maintained dock assigned at the time to William Rhodes for nearly 30 minutes. After that, it cut straight toward Devil's Hook, where the signal stopped. The timeline matched everything else. The failed call at 6:44, the notebook entries, the footage of a black boat circling near Devil's Hook. Investigators now had proof that Walter had stopped near Rhodes's dock. The implication was clear. He wasn't alone. A warrant was issued for a search of Rhodes' old home, a small property outside Albany he'd sold in 2019. In the detached garage under a dusty workbench, officers found a sealed metal storage box. Inside, wrapped in foam, was a black Lowrance fish finder, the exact model missing from Walter's boat. It had been wiped clean, but DNA embedded in the foam casing matched Rhodes. That same day, an arrest warrant was issued. But when police arrived at Rhodes's new residence in Lapine, he was gone. His wallet, phone, and vehicle were still there. But he wasn't. Surveillance picked up nothing. He had vanished before they reached the door. It was no longer a question of whether Walter had encountered someone that day. It was a question of how far Rhodes had gone to bury the evidence. Walter had wrapped the GPS in canvas. He'd hidden it beneath the boat, preserving the story he couldn't finish writing. The boat had returned because something had been left behind, something that refused to stay buried. For the Keene family, it wasn't closure, but it was proof. Walter hadn't gotten lost. He hadn't slipped. He'd left a trail. The truth had been sitting beneath the hull the entire time, waiting for someone to dig. By early 2024, the mystery that haunted Lake Merrill for nearly a decade had become something else. A case solved not by witness accounts or confessions, but by a man's determination to be found. Walter Keene hadn't vanished quietly. He'd tried to leave behind a record of what happened. And piece by piece, that record forced the truth to the surface. Investigators now believe that on the morning of July 9, 2014, Walter was confronted by William Rhodes, then a park ranger, on or near the water. Whether it was about fishing territory, a past grudge, or something darker, no one knows. But something escalated. Walter's notes showed growing fear. He wrote down the presence of a black boat. He wrote down the name they called him by. And crucially, he wrote, "Don't trust the ranger." The GPS data recovered from beneath his boat confirmed it all. Walter's path was methodical until his engine began failing near the ranger's dock, Rhodes' dock. The boat stayed there nearly 30 minutes. Then it turned sharply and headed toward Devil's Hook, where everything ended. No one knows exactly what happened at Devil's Hook, whether Walter was pushed, jumped, or collapsed trying to escape. But the aftermath was deliberate. Rhodes removed the GPS unit. He dragged the boat through the northern floodplain into deep brush, hiding it beneath the trees where it would remain buried for nearly a decade. He returned to his life, unbothered, until the storm exposed what he'd tried to erase. The boat's return led to a full re-examination. A sealed metal box was found in Rhodes's former garage. Inside it, Walter's stolen fish finder. Rhodes's DNA was on the foam. It was enough. An arrest warrant was issued, but he fled before police arrived. His vehicle, wallet, and phone were found abandoned near Lapine, but he was gone. In February 2024, after a multi-state manhunt, William Rhodes was captured in Nevada. He didn't resist. In court, the evidence overwhelmed him: Walter's notebook, the GPS path, the hidden fish finder, and the timeline. In September, Rhodes was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 32 years in prison. Walter's boat was returned to his family. They didn't bring it home. Instead, they placed it near the dock where he'd launched that morning. A small stone plaque sits beside it now. It reads, "He didn't vanish. He tried to be found." The lake had hidden the truth for 9 years, but Walter left too much behind. The notebook, the wrapped GPS, the bait still in place. All of it pointed to a man who wasn't trying to disappear. He was trying to be remembered. and eventually he was.